Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of True Drew Podcast, and today we're going to do something really interesting and change it up. So for today's episode, we're going to jump right in and discuss the 1970s Nancy Drew / Hardy Boys TV show. So I have had a ton of requests and a ton of DMs on Instagram. When are you going to do the 1970s Nancy Drew show? When are you going to talk about it? So that is what we're going to focus on today. So I didn't really know much about this show, and I had never watched any of the episodes, so this is my first time watching it, first time reactions, and I figured what we would do is we would go through the first season of the show and just discuss Nancy's episodes. So it's every other episode, so I think that works up to about 7 episodes, and so today we're going to be covering season 1, Episode 2, The Mystery of Pirates Cove. So the Hardy Boys got the first episode, and then Nancy got the second episode, and then it just alternates till the end of the season. Now, I thought it would be cool to kind of discuss some facts about this show, and this show starred Pamela Sue Martin as Nancy, Sean Cassidy as Joe Hardy, and Parker Stevenson as Frank Hardy. It's funny because I have an Etsy shop and I sell a lot of vintage stuff on the side. I've actually come across a Sean Cassidy t-shirt and I sold it for someone, and it was so funny. Apparently, all of the starring actors and actresses in this show were kind of heartthrobs. Another fun random fact about this show, I didn't know that Jamie Lee Curtis actually auditioned for the part of Nancy Drew, which is crazy because she has a cameo role later on in one of the other episodes in the show. But how crazy is that to imagine like a universe where Jamie Lee Curtis could have been Nancy? Now, another thing to take note of when it comes to this show, like I said before, season 1 alternated between the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew for different episodes. And in season 2, they were all together in the same episodes. And the reason for this being, from what I could gather on my research that I did on the internet, the Hardy Boys episodes were doing way better than the Nancy Drew episodes. I mean, namely because they had 2 teen heartthrobs, and I think that kind of pulled in a lot of the viewership from teenage girls. But Pamela Sue Martin was not very happy about this. She really wanted Nancy Drew and herself to have her own show. But I mean, if you look at the way that the first season is formatted, they really didn't have their own show. It was like it's within one show with alternating episodes. I do understand though. I do get it though. That would be hard to like hear. Your show episodes are not doing as well as these. Now, the show came out in 1977 and the pilot was actually filmed in only 24 hours, which is kind of crazy. But when you watch that episode of the Hardy Boys, like you can kind of tell. And a lot of it's filmed at night, which it's so hard to see some stuff, but it was later canceled, the entire show, in 1978. And another cool fact, the guy who plays Ned Nickerson on the show, his name is George O'Hanlon Jr. His dad, George O'Hanlon, voiced George Jetson in the cartoon The Jetsons. And the last fact that I have before we jump into my direct quotes and notes, there is no Hannah Gruen on this show. There's no character by that name, and actually George Fayne on the show is a combination of George and Bess from the books, and she's played by Jean Raisey. But I don't know, it's kind of weird because since they combined aspects of George's character and Bess's character, sometimes the George on this show comes across as being kind of bipolar, because one minute she'll be like, yeah, Nancy, let's chase after the bad guys, and then the next moment she's like, no, I'm scared. Oh, and one last note on casting. So Carson Drew is played by an actor named William Shallert, and I thought he did a pretty decent job in some episodes. So now, without further ado, let's jump into my notes for Season 1, Episode 2, The Mystery of Pirates Cove. So the first note that I took while watching the episode is the maze intro and theme song is interesting. I had never seen it before, and I was like, oh wow, this is very jerky, and the theme song's kind of wonky, but I do like how they show the different book covers with Pamela Sue Martin on them. So they took the original cover art of Nancy off, and they just superimposed Pamela Sue Martin. And I think that's really a neat touch. It's kind of cementing in our minds, like, this is Nancy. Now, for the first opening shot of this episode, we have Nancy and George and Ned, and they're at some party by the beach, and they're dancing to some weird saxophone music, and it's kind of bumping, but it kind of sounds like the type of music that you would hear on hold. And Nancy's just kind of like bebopping over there, and Ned and George are watching Nancy from the side of the dance floor. And George is basically like, "You like Nancy, huh, Ned?" And he's like, "No, shut up. Like, don't talk about it." And so we instantly, I don't know, I didn't really like what we were getting from Ned or from George, honestly. We'll get to George later, but we'll talk about Ned real quick. So this kind of ties in with my next note, but Ned has Coke bottle glasses, and he's not exactly what I was picturing. Like, he's kind of depicted as this nerdy guy on the show, and he apparently works for Carson, Nancy's dad, which is a weird dynamic. But yeah, the show really plays up like Ned is a nerd. And in the books, Ned was very much, he was sporty, he was athletic, he was a jock. So I don't know if I really liked this direction that they took with Ned. He's also blonde. In the books, he has darker hair, and I could almost overlook that if they had gotten the other parts of his portrayal correct. But another thing that I kind of picked up on about Ned's characterization in this show, like, Ned was always there to support Nancy in the books and help out when needed. And, sometimes she does take him for granted, but Ned is never like overbearing or pushy, at least from the books that I've read so far. But in the show, he just kind of comes across as like, "Well, Nancy, I don't think you're capable. I'm afraid for you. I'm worried for you, but I don't think you're capable." And in the books, it was very much like, "Nancy, I'm worried about you, but I know you can do this." So yeah, it's nothing against the actor, George O'Hanlon. I think it's more just the show probably was like, "We're going to go in this direction," and that's what they did. So the next thing that I wrote down is, we're getting on a boat. This can't be good. So right after Nancy's like done dancing and stuff at the party, they get on this boat. She, George, Ned, and some guy, I think it's the guy who hosted the party, and I honestly can't remember his name. It's not even important because he literally doesn't play into any other part of the episode. But they're out on the boat sailing around, and then they come across a lot of dead fish, and so they're just commenting on that, and they're like, "Oh, this is weird. Usually you don't see a bunch of dead fish just floating in the water like this." And about that same time, they see that someone is up in the abandoned lighthouse because there's lights on. Very spooky and suspicious. But this kind of reminded me of the game Danger on Deception Island, because there's a lighthouse in that game, and we actually find dead fish in that game too. And obviously the computer came after the show, so one influenced the other, but very cool. So it's at this point in the episode when Nancy, Ned, and George are very concerned because someone's in this abandoned lighthouse. So they call the sheriff out, and he comes to the lighthouse to meet them. And he says there's no way anyone could have gotten into the lighthouse unless they were a ghost. But as they all drive off, we see a creepy guy at the window. So the next thing that I wrote down is Ned forgot to pick Carson up at the airport. Great job, Ned. So Carson is, of course, all frazzled about this, but it's so funny because I'm like, if Ned's an intern or whatever for Carson, like, he's not making the best impression. So it's around this part of the episode that we figure out that Carson apparently manages the lighthouse property, and there's some professor who's interested in buying it, and he does paranormal studies. So they're talking this out and discussing, and then we cut back to Nancy and George, who are sawing the lock off the lighthouse door. And I just now thought, like, okay, so if Carson manages the lighthouse property, why didn't Nancy just ask him for the key to the lighthouse door? Like, maybe he didn't want to give it to her. Maybe he didn't want her out there trespassing or whatever. But I'm like, I mean, wouldn't that have been better than sawing the lock off? Maybe he doesn't have the key. I don't know. But this part doesn't really make sense, but we'll go with it because it's Nancy Drew, and I love Nancy Drew no matter what plot holes I find. Maybe Carson just manages the actual land property and doesn't have anything to do with the lighthouse itself. I don't know. It is really funny though, because once Nancy and George get into the stairwell of the lighthouse, they get scared by a bat that's trapped in there, and it's just kind of a tense scene, but George goes to investigate these tire tracks that they saw going over the cliff. And then Nancy's like, okay, I'll go up to the top of the lighthouse by myself. This sounds like a fantastic plan, but they're kind of curious about the tire tracks because it's supposed to be an abandoned property, so nobody should be out there. But it's when they're doing this that Professor Wall shows up, the same professor that was interested in studying the lighthouse for paranormal related reasons. And he sneaks up on George, and she's at the very edge of the cliff, so this was creepy. This had my radar going off. I was like, I'm already suspicious of this guy because you don't sneak up on a woman when she's near the edge of a cliff, or really anytime. Like, you announce yourself and you're like, hey, you don't want to scare someone. But meanwhile, Nancy, who's up in the lighthouse tower, has found all these footprints in the dust. And so she's like, somebody's been here, and they've been here recently. So she goes back downstairs to get George and the professor, and they go up to see the ghostly footprints, and they're all gone. Like, all the dust is gone. Like, someone has mysteriously, like, Mr. Cleaned the place since she's been down the steps and back up them in 5 minutes. I don't know how that happens. But Nancy is very insistent. She's like, no, there were footprints up here. And then Professor Wall's like, maybe there's a ghost. I don't know about you, but I have never encountered a ghost. And even if I had, like, it never cleaned my house. Like, how cool would that be? Like a ghostly cleaner lady or man? I don't know. Whatever. Spick and span spirits. So the next thing that I wrote down is Ned is very protective of Nancy in this show, which we kind of talked about earlier, but he's also really jealous. And when Nancy says she wants to stay overnight at the lighthouse with Professor Wall while he does these paranormal studies, Ned gets really upset. But honestly, I gotta say, I kind of understand it because this professor has got to be at least 15 years older than Nancy. Like, it's kind of weird, and he's making all these flirty comments, and it's like, you don't just stay overnight at a lighthouse with a professor while he does, like, EVP recordings. Like, I don't know, like, it's weird to me that Carson sees no problem with this, but Ned is the one that's like, hey, maybe Nancy shouldn't go stay at the creepy lighthouse with the creepy older professor. Like, just a thought. Ned Nickerson, voice of reason. Okay, so this next note is kind of funny, but I said George is alternately whiny and scared. So yeah, I don't know what they were doing with the characterizations of Nancy's friends in this show, but I'm not really a fan. Like, I really wish they had had George and Bess and Hannah Gruen, but I don't know. George will one minute be like, yeah, let's go do this, and then she'll be terrified out of her mind the next. So it's hard to predict what she's going to say, but I will say this, George has some very funny quotes, which we'll get to in a little bit, but I really didn't like her whininess. Like, she would literally be like, Nancy, why are we doing this? And it's like, George, just get with the program. So the next thing that I wrote down is just, I want to stay in a lighthouse, which I've always thought that would be really cool. Like, I've been in several lighthouses, and they're really, really neat, but I mean, it'd probably get old going up and down those stairs all the time, but it would be a neat experience. So Professor Wall is talking to Nancy and George about the lighthouse, and he says that there are legends of caverns underneath the lighthouse and sailors that have gone missing. And if this didn't make me think of Danger on Deception Island, like Benjamin Hawkins, anyone? Like, we're shanghaiing or, taking people off to sea in these boats. I think it's called press ganging also. But yeah, made me think of that game so much. So the next thing to happen in this episode is Nancy and George are staying overnight in this lighthouse with this creepy professor, and Nancy catches the professor in a lie, and he's playing a recording of spooky noises, so he's basically trying to make it seem like, oh, the spirits are talking to us. And he confesses that he wanted the property because of rumors of a treasure on it. So he totally pulled an Abby Sedaris from Message in a Haunted Mansion. He's like, I'm just gonna set up all these little recordings and things, and they'll think that it's spooky and they'll want to leave. Now later the next day, Nancy and Ned go down to the beach near the lighthouse, and they find a cave opening that they think is usually underwater during high tide. So of course they're like, let's go through it. Do you see where this is going? Because like in The Mystery of the Tolling Bell, Nancy had no knowledge whatsoever of high and low tide until almost the end of the book. And she was like, oh, the water goes up and down. Like, yeah. And so the stuff that's exposed to the air now is going to be underwater very, very soon. But anyways, Nancy kind of speculates, well, maybe somebody blew it open with explosives, and that's why there's so many dead fish out in the harbor, which, okay, fair assumption. But they go through this tunnel and they get scared of a skeleton, which was really, really creepy. Like, I mean, if I saw a skeleton in a tunnel, I think I would turn back around. I'd be like, oh, okay, well, I don't want to meet that person's fate, so I'm just gonna go back and go home and read a book. Reading books is much safer, kids. Much safer than traipsing through tunnels right before high tide comes in. I'm just laughing at the absurdity of my notes because I'll be taking notes on the actual plot and then I'll be taking notes of what Nancy's wearing because, like, I love a good outfit. And so I wrote down Nancy's ascot/scarf game is on point in this episode. Like, we're about to drown, but, looking pretty stylish. So what do you know, the tide starts rolling in and Nancy and Ned freak out, and Nancy ends up climbing up on a ledge and she finds the treasure and she's like, oh, look at this. But Professor Wall actually ends up opening a door at the last minute and saving them. Like, he's just on the other side of the wall and he hears them like screaming for help because the waves are getting up to pretty much their necks. And so he's conveniently there and saves the day. Remember this for later because it's highly suspicious and it comes back later in the episode. Now you may be wondering, where is George during all this? Was she like busy, or was she, standing on the beach waiting for them to come back? So no, apparently George went on a trip to New York and went on a shopping spree. She just drops that information on us. And she shows Nancy that the book the professor showed them with the treasure legend was altered. So earlier in the episode, when Professor Wall was showing Nancy and George the stories of, there was maybe caverns underneath this lighthouse and sailors would get taken from these caverns, and he talked about the treasure, well, he planted that. He planted that evidence for them to see. He wanted to play up that legend and for them to hear it, and he wanted them to find this treasure, because that treasure was a little bit too easy to find. So we're getting into some deep fake type territory here. Now, the next thing that happens is Nancy ends up going to confront Professor Wall, and he came into $2 million, apparently. He had all these coins and all this gold, which is the treasure that she found, but he didn't want to report it to the IRS, so he planted the treasure and came up with this grand scheme of saying, oh, I found this and, I located it, so maybe I don't have to pay taxes on it, which it's like, that's not how this works. Like, the IRS always gets what they're owed. That's the one thing that they do really, really well. Their website, horrible and in the Stone Age, but they will get their cut. Now, thankfully, the police show up when the professor is about to, get rid of Nancy because she knows too much. But Ned ends up talking to the police and he says Nancy imagines herself a detective, and Nancy corrects him and says part-time investigator. Honestly, you know what? That needs to be Nancy Drew's epitaph on her tombstone. Like, Nancy Drew, she knew too much. Here lies the girl who meddled way too much, because she always finds herself in these situations where she confronts the villain, but she's told nobody where she is, and she just, it's so insanely lucky that the authorities or somebody shows up at the right moment of time. So some final thoughts after watching this first episode of the 1970s Nancy Drew TV show. I really like Pamela Sue Martin as Nancy. I really wish she had red or strawberry blonde hair, but I feel like her portrayal of Nancy is pretty good. Now, I did take down some funny quotes from this episode because I thought that they were just too great not to talk about. So this first quote is from George, and she said, "Ned, why don't you tell her she turns your brain into a souffle and be done with it. So this quote comes from the scene where George and Ned are kind of standing off on the sidelines watching Nancy dance. This next quote is from Ned, and they're talking about flying fish, when they find the dead fish out in the harbor, and he said, "There's a reason that fish isn't flying. He's dead." Very astute, Mr. Nickerson. There were a lot of funny quotes from this scene because they start scooping out the dead fish and they're looking at it, and Nancy says, "It's limp." And then Ned says, "Yeah, death does that to you." This next quote is again from George, and she says, "You're the detective, Nancy. I'm just the locksmith." And then when Nancy and George are at the lighthouse with the professor looking for ghosts, Nancy says, "What do you have to ward off evil spirits?" And Professor Wall says, "Chocolate chip cookies," because everyone knows that there's nothing that the undead fear more, or that ghosts fear more, than Famous Amos chocolate chip cookies. Like, I'm sorry, you'd have to be dead or in another dimension to not enjoy chocolate chip cookies. And the last quote that I wrote down is from Nancy, and she says, "Elementary, my dear Ned." So now let's talk about the things that I liked and the things I didn't like about Episode 2, Mystery at Pirates Cove. So I really enjoyed the 70s vibes. I really liked that, the outfits, some of the slang, and, Nancy dancing to saxophone music in the first 5 minutes. I was like, okay, this is like kind of groovy, and I liked the lighthouse setting. And the thing that I didn't really like, I didn't like the creepy professor. Like, he was a lot older than Nancy and flirting a little bit too much to be appropriate. And I really didn't like how Ned Nickerson was portrayed. Like, I got used to it the more I watched the show, and I just learned to accept it. But watching this first episode, I was like, you just don't really seem like Ned Nickerson to me. Now, another thing that I thought would be cool to do with these 1970s TV show episodes, I thought it would be neat to pick out the books and games from the Nancy Drew franchise that this episode reminded me of. So right off the bat, I already said this a couple times during the episode, but this episode of the 70s TV show reminded me of Danger on Deception Island, the game, because there's a lighthouse, there's dead fish, there's several things within this plot. There's even the mentioning of the caverns underneath the lighthouse, which is a key part of the game. And I think this episode also reminded me of the book, The Mystery of the Tolling Bell, because again, we have these caverns and we have the high and low tide, and it kind of takes place in a seaside town, so it had some similarities. So when it comes to giving this episode of the TV show a magnifying glass rating, I would give this 4 magnifying glasses. It was a pretty good start to Nancy Drew's episodes for the show. I feel like they went in a really cool direction with it. I liked like I said, the lighthouse setting, the seaside setting, and I feel like other than some minor problems that I have with the characterizations, I feel like it was a strong episode. So yeah, that concludes this first episode discussing the 1970s TV show. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm really looking forward to jumping into the other episodes that we have for this season, which we're going to do in order. And I really enjoy the show so far, and I cannot wait to watch season 2 at some later date. So for next week's episode, we're going to jump into season 1, episode 4 of the 1970s Nancy Drew Hardy Boys TV show, and it's The Mystery of the Diamond Triangle. I'll see you all next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.